Believe it or not, vegans and keto people both get some things right. So I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. Because these are groups that I sometimes do harp on for their extremism. But when you really look at evidence and you take a scientific and evidence-based approach, there are things that both of these groups get right. And because they get these things right, many people who go into these sort of diets who are coming out of something like a standard American diet do tend to start losing body fat, and they do see some health improvements. Even though these diets get a lot of things wrong, they get some major points right. Each one of them has at least one major point that matters tremendously for both body composition and for overall health. So obviously, if people are making that one change, then guess what? Well, those things are going to improve. And specifically, let's talk about these briefly. And I'll go into a little more detail, but what the vegans get right is that, yes, animal fats in general, not particularly good for us. Saturated fat is bad for us, and that's pretty well heavily supported in the literature. What the keto people get right is refined sugars. Refined sugar is technically, for all purposes, and people get upset. I've seen people get really upset when you say this. It is technically toxic to your body. Okay? And a lot of people are unaware of that. And it's not that fructose itself is a problem. Our body handles fructose fairly well in certain ways, but it's the refined fructose from it. If enough of it gets through your body to get to your liver processes it in a manner that is very similar. It's almost an identical process to how it processes alcohol. Okay, because we can't burn the fructose. We can't use it for fuel. And again, I want to state, a lot of fructose in your diet itself is not the problem. It's the refined sugars that have fructose with no fiber in it that are absorbed differently. That is your major problem, and it's quantitative. So it's the same with either one. Eating very small amounts of saturated fat will have no negative impact on you, and very small amounts of refined sugar probably will have no negative impact. But since these diets tend to avoid these, and these are some of the worst things we can eat, these are the two things that probably contribute the most negatively to our overall health and to our obesity situation. Okay, because they both contribute so massively, and they're up at the top of the list at this point. Any diet that removes one of those two compared to a standard American diet is probably going to see benefits. It makes sense. Now, people get upset when you bring those up, though. So let's discuss that. Yes, animal fats in general are just not as healthy as plant fats, even when they're compared, and the exception maybe being EPA and DHA found in certain marine fats, right? Fatty fish and things. But we don't need huge quantities of those for optimal health, okay? Barring those, setting those aside, because anything else is such trace amounts of those that it's almost not worth mentioning. Other than if maybe you're doing omega-3 eggs or something. But even grass-fed beef, which people bring up, has too small of an amount to even supply the amount you need in your diet if your body wasn't making any on its own. But yeah, in general, even things like the monounsaturated fats found in animals, when it's compared in the lab, doesn't produce the same health benefits. It's not as beneficial to our health as plant fats. So in other words, animal fats, barring EPA and DHA, just on average are not necessarily good for us. Saturated fats, almost irrespective of the source, are problematic. And everyone who brings up, dietary cholesterol doesn't impact, say, stop. No one's talking about dietary cholesterol, because saturated fat has calories. It's an actual type of fatty acid you can burn as fuel. Cholesterol is a completely different thing. And there's obviously overlap, but it's not 100%. There are foods high in cholesterol that have almost no saturated fat. Of course, they're all animal source. And there are plants that have no cholesterol that are high in saturated fat, something like palm oil, right? So we're talking purely about the saturated fat. The problem becomes when vegans jump over and say, it's just the animal fat that's the problem, and then they'll eat large amounts of plant saturated fats and then still develop the same health problems It's the people eating bacon and doing bacon and eggs for breakfast every day. Okay, they run into the same problems because they didn't understand that it's the saturated fat. But on a whole, yeah, so their concerns with the health impacts of animal products is purely due to the dietary fat. That is it. And they don't always grasp that really lean animal proteins are actually fantastic. So when you understand that point, though, it makes sense. So yes, saturated fat itself is a problem. The least negative of the saturated fats from animals tends to come from dairy. Again, but it's only less negative when it's in a whole food. Once you start separating it out into something like heavy cream or butter, it has completely different benefits or negatives in the lab. It is actually considerably, dramatically worse for you. Whereas in whole milk is not really so bad. But again, on a whole, it is saturated fats and it is animal source fats that are a major problem for us in excess. But we eat those in excess, and that's the issue. We eat them in excess, and people can argue, well, they're found not in the quantities we eat them in. Even grass-fed beef has way more fat and saturated fat than wild game does, way more. So they're not even comparable. So don't even try to bring the natural thing into it. Same thing with refined sugars. So the keto people get that right. Refined sugars, because our body is adapted to handling fructose, we handle decently high amounts of dietary fructose found in foods. But it's because our GI tract is able to convert the fructose. It ferments it, your gut flora ferments it into glucose. The majority of it you eat from like fruit doesn't reach the bloodstream as fructose, right? It gets fermented in the gut, but the problem with refined sugars, it gets absorbed in the upper intestine, not the lower, because it gets absorbed way faster because it's just in a pure form. So it gets taken directly into the bloodstream without going through that process that fruits and other things would. And then you're left with just the enzymes in your bloodstream that can handle a certain amount of it, but it has a limited capacity for it. And then everything else, when it starts reaching the liver, your liver has to process it, just like it would a toxin or a poison, okay? Because it is for our bodies. So the problem is, again, it's a quantitative issue, just like the saturated fat. It's a quantitative issue in terms of insulin resistance, building up fatty liver, and then a development of atherosclerosis through elevated LDL-C. Okay, but it's still a quantitative issue. So it's the same with the fructose, right? It's the amount of fructose that is hitting your bloodstream in a period of time that's a problem. It's not all fructose in the diet. This is what creates the problems, and they both get these things right. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.